Senator Markley, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon to you, Madam President. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I can't resist the opportunity to talk a little bit about historical considerations that are brought up by this resolution. I get so tired of talking about our current situation. Every time I'm called on to do it, I feel like I just spread gloom around the gathering. So in recent months, I've actually preferred history, and this resolution gives me an excuse to address it a little bit. And I'd say that the history of this country has been the history of the growth of executive power relative to legislative power, a problem that the founders anticipated and did everything they could to prevent. But it's natural, as the executive branch has grown enormously, that the power of the legislature to restrain it has been reduced. And I think that this is a misunderstanding we have about the relationship between the President and the Senate as it stands right now. The Senate has every right to not act, to not have hearings, to not do anything it wants to do if that's how it feels it can restrain presidential power. And I would say about Supreme Court nominations in particular that there's been an evolution, but the evolution has gone in various directions. And the idea that we have that somehow the Senate is simply a body to give consent and that their only obligation is to make sure that the person is qualified and not ethically challenged is a development very much of the 20th century. Throughout the 19th century, throughout the 18th century, Supreme Court nominations were routinely turned down on purely political grounds. George Washington had one of his Supreme Court nominations rejected by the Senate in his second term, simply because the senators didn't like the man that he nominated. And although Senator Duff refers to hearings having been held and action taken, in the 19th century, Democratic-controlled Senates repeatedly failed to act at all on nominations from the opposing party. Again, simply because they didn't like the nominees and they didn't want to give the president the satisfaction of a vote. That kind of pitched battle over Supreme Court nomination, in some cases with Senate controlled by the president's party turning down his recommendation, continued really into the middle of the 20th century. So a lot of us grew up, I think, at the tail end of what was an unusual era of good feeling when it comes to Supreme Court nominations. That in the 50s and 60s and going into the 70s, there was a sense that unless there was a real problem with a nominee, the Senate was almost obliged to accept that nominee regardless of their particular philosophical background. And I think it's possible to say, to get us quickly up to current times. I'll say incidentally, too, when we're talking about having hearings, the first justice to have a hearing ever was John Harlan, who was nominated by Eisenhower in the 50s. And interestingly, the Judiciary Committee, which of course held the hearing, then refused to vote on the justice. They held up the nomination for a year. That was because Southern Democrat segregationists were afraid that Eisenhower's nominee would be pro-integration, as in fact he was. So the idea that there's no precedent for not having hearings exists. In the 60s, really the first nomination I remember, and maybe some of my more distinguished colleagues may remember as well, was Abe Fortas, who was nominated by President Johnson to take over for Earl Warren as Chief Justice. Fortas was already an Associate Justice on the court. And Fortas's nomination was blocked by a filibuster, a bipartisan filibuster, both Southern Democrats and Republicans. But I think more Democrats were part of the filibuster than Republicans. And that was on ideological grounds, but it's interesting, and of course, the case could be made that this was a misuse of legislative power. It's worth remembering that Fortas was forced to resign his Supreme Court seat only a year or two afterwards because of ethical violations. It turned out that, interestingly, he was paid for speaking engagements. 9 speeches he gave for a total of $15,000. And that was judged to be an improper activity for a Supreme Court justice to be taking part in. I think that by today's standards, 9 speeches for $15,000 would be a bargain compared to what you pay to get the Secretary of State. But that's a case where it was certainly a good thing that the Senate blocked that nomination, and blocked it by not taking it up. We had Nixon's, some of you will remember Judges Haynesworth and Carswell, who were turned down by the Democratic Senate under Nixon's administration. But the real end of this era of good feelings came with Robert Bork, and which I think all of us are old enough to remember. A man whose qualifications as a judicial thinker were beyond question, and whose ethics were beyond question. In fact, Vice President Biden, before Bork was nominated, when asked about him, he was asked, would you automatically vote for a conservative justice? He said, well, it would depend on the justice, but if it was somebody like Robert Bork, how could I vote against him? A year later, he voted against him. Bork was the dividing line on this issue of whether the Senate has the obligation to confirm the president's wishes, whether they like the trend of those wishes or not. And since Bork, we've been in a different world. What's happening this year is an extension of that. And I actually think it's a show of strength by the legislative branch, which is overdue. And I would say, in reference to this resolution, that if we're going to start urging the Senate to take up matters, the matters that I would most like to see them take up again are matters of war and peace. I think it's been outrageous under both Republican and Democratic administrations that the Congress, which is the sole war-making power in this country, has ceded that authority of life and death to the president. Both here on the state level and on the national level, I think that what we should resolve to do is to take up our duties aggressively. And of course, finally, I would say amen to everything that my colleague Senator McLaughlin said. Our job here is not to tell the U.S. Senate what to do. Our job is to do the extremely difficult work which lies ahead of us. I tremble when I think we only have 4 weeks left to get that work done. And I know I can anticipate what it's going to be like for the last week. That's the work I would prefer to see us taking up today. So with regard to the interest in federal affairs that this resolution represents, which I share, I still feel that it is misplaced and, in this particular instance, misguided in its intent, and I will vote against it. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. Will you remark for the Senate?